This lecture is an overview of the law of contracts. In this lecture, I will explain to you how the law of contracts can be organized into 6 major subparts. And this structure of the law of contracts is very helpful when you are making outlines of an answer. You look for problems in part 1, you look for problems in part 2, and so forth. Now, in this overview of the law of contracts, I will freely use the facts from Motors versus Jones, which is a UCC problem, and buyer-seller turbine, which is a UCC problem, and the Owens-Carter problem, which is a common law problem. I will use these facts quite freely, and it is important in order for you to follow the lecture to pre-read the facts of these 3 problems. You do not need to do a pre-analysis. We'll do the analysis together, but you do need to pre-read them. Additionally, besides doing the overview and explaining how the law of contracts is organized into these 6 parts, I will then analyze these 3 questions in detail. So you'll see not only what issues are there and what the law is on those issues, but in some places I will literally tell you what words you should write or could write as an answer to that part of the question, so that you really understand the concept that you give a rule of law and then use the facts to try to satisfy the rule, as opposed to just kind of generally analyzing facts. So that's what this lecture is all about, and let's get started. The law of contracts can easily and conveniently and helpfully be organized into 6 major parts, and I'm going to tell you about those parts. And part 1 is the formation of a contract. Now, the formation of a contract is important. Something like 90 to 95% of the contracts questions on the California bar exam have major issues regarding whether or not the people really have a contract at all. And so be prepared, because I did a recent sample of the bar questions by picking 12 bar questions randomly and looking through to see what percentage of those have major formation issues. And in that sample, it turned out to be 92%. Other samples, it turns out to be about the same. So you really need your formation wrapped down. You need it down for both common law contracts as well as for UCC contracts. If the contract has been formed, the next major area is what I call clarifying the terms. Now, this clarification of the terms, I also sometimes refer to that as interpretation of the contract. And what I really mean is, what do you do in these 3 situations that I'm going to put on the board? Number 1, suppose there is the parole evidence rule. Number 2, ambiguity. And number 3, mistake. Now, in these 3 situations, you have a contract, but there's some question as to what the terms of the contract really are. And obviously, you cannot enforce a contract without knowing what the terms are. The 3 kinds of problems that you have with the terms here, and this comes up, by the way, on something like 10 to 15% of the bar questions. The parole evidence rule, in summary, is the rule that deals with the problem where you and I have been negotiating for 6 months about your buying my car for $100,000. And I've got this fancy Rolls Royce, and It's got, polka dots and stripes all over it, and it's unique, and people like it, ha, ha, ha. So you're going to buy my car for $100,000. After 6 months of negotiations, we write a written contract, and it says, you are to buy Emerson's car for $100,000. That's all it says. Now, during the 6 months when we've been talking about this, we talked about my replacing 2 of the tires. We talked about my getting the radio repaired, and there was a scratch on a fender. We talked about my repairing that scratch. And so now the question becomes, the contract that we've just written says you're to buy my car for $100,000. Am I supposed to do that stuff that we talked about during the last 6 months? Is that a part of this contract or not? Are those oral discussions that happened before the contract was written, are those oral discussions a part of this contract or not? And that's what the parole evidence rule is about. The answer obviously turns on whether or not we intended for the writing to be complete. If we intended for the writing to be final and complete, then these previous discussions are not a part of it. If we did not intend for the writings to be final and complete, then the final and complete is also called integrated. If we did not intend for the writings to be integrated, final and complete, then those previous writings might be a part, depends on what we intended. Now, so the problem now becomes, how do you decide whether or not the writings which we do have were intended by us to be the final and complete expression on this subject? Did we intend for them to be integrated or not? And there are 2 theories on that, the Williston theory and the Corbin theory, as to how you determine that, and you're expected to apply those 2 theories to a problem that comes up like this. The 2 theories under the Williston view, the theory is that you have to stay within the 4 corners of the document. You can only use what's on the written document to decide whether or not we intended for the writing to be final and complete. Under the Corbin view, which is a more recent view, you can go outside the document and use any evidence that you can get your hands on to try to establish whether or not the parties intended for this very document to be final and complete. So those are the 2 views, and you're expected to use them. Ambiguity. Again, the basic problem with ambiguity is what were the real terms? And if we use a word that has more than one meaning, then what did we mean? And so, and now these ambiguity problems, you got to watch them, because at the time when you read the problem for the first time on the bar exam and you look at those words, you will not see the ambiguity at first. And the reason for that is because people don't get into contracts where it is obvious that the terms are ambiguous. They try to clear them up so that they think it's clear at the time that they sign the contract. And then it turns out later that it's not clear. And that's the way these bar questions are going to be. For example, there's one question where the bar examiner said that the trash disposal company is supposed to empty the trash within 48 hours after being notified that the container is almost full. Now, and that seems clear. 48 hours, I mean, how can the number 48 be ambiguous? Well, how about Christmas Day? If the 48 hours ends on Christmas Day, is this disposal company supposed to come out and empty that stuff on Christmas Day or not? And they had talked about this prior to signing the contract. And so now their discussions about it may or may not end up in the contract, in the writing, depending on whether or not how the parole evidence rule is applied. And secondly, the term is arguably ambiguous because in the industry, if in the industry nobody picks up waste on Christmas Day, then they probably didn't mean that for them to pick it up on Christmas Day. And so 48 hours has more than one meaning in certain circumstances. So you needed, in that case, you needed to argue that it was both ambiguous because of the way 48 hours is used on certain holidays, and that it also parole evidence rule as to whether or not the previous discussions were supposed to be in there. So ambiguity and parole evidence rule, and there are rules about how you try to determine the ambiguity. Again, the ambiguity turns on the intent of the parties. That is to say, if you and I write a contract and there's an ambiguous term, what the legal system has to be trying to do is to figure out what did we mean by that term. And so, again, our intent on the term is what counts. Parole evidence rule is intent for the term, for the writing to be final and complete. Ambiguity, what did the parties intend to say? And likewise with mistake. If you and I have written a contract and in the contract we agreed on the telephone that I was going to charge you 90 cents a pound for some bolts, and when I typed up the confirmation and sent it to you, it said 91 cents per pound. It was just my typing error. Okay? Now, you must agree that I do not have the legal power to change our contract just by typing it badly. Okay? And so my typing 91 cents didn't change our legal relationship. Okay? It's just bad typing. And so what do? You try to figure, you go back to the intent of the parties was the terms of the contract, 90 cents a pound. So you correct the writing to reflect the true intent of the parties. And we say that formally by saying you reform the writing to conform to the intent of the parties. So all three of these involve the intent of the parties. What did the parties intend for the writing to say? What did the parties intend for it to mean? And did they intend for the oral expressions to even be included? This is on the bar exam about 15% of the time. Now, our next area, after you have formed a contract and you clarify the terms, then the next big thing is changing, making changes or amending the contract. Every kind of legal relationship that people can form with each other, there's some mechanism for changing it. You know that. And so if you and I form a contract, there's got to be mechanisms for amending the contract to change to something else we want. And that's the next major area. And this area, I'll call it changes in the contract. Now, in this area of changes to the contract, there are really two types of changes you can make. You can make a change in the terms of the contract, and you can change the people. Changing the terms of the contract, the two ways that can happen is you might modify the contract and you might waive a right. So modification and waiver are the two ways that you might change the terms of the contract. It is fairly common for the bar examiners to put in a modification in a contract. We have that in 2 out of the 3 problems today, where the contract was formed and then the parties sought to modify it. And I'll show you that. People, you waive conditions. For example, I am a homeowner, and I've hired you to build a home for me. And part of the contract says that you get paid when I get the architect's certificate of completion. Well, you finish the house and I come out and look at it and it looks great to me. Architect's out of town, and I say to you, I waive the condition of the architect's certificate because that's a condition preceding to my duty to pay you. And so I'm saying to you that I am waiving that condition, and I can do that if I want to, and so that changes the terms of the contract. So these are the 2 ways to change the terms. There are 4 ways to change the people in the contract. They are, number 1, assignment of rights. Number 2, delegation of duties. Number 3, novation. And number 4, revoking the rights of a third party beneficiary. Let's talk about each of these for a moment. First, assignment of rights. Let's suppose that you and I have a contract where you're supposed to buy my car for $100,000, this ridiculous car that I described to you a few minutes ago. It's got polka dots and stripes on the outside of it, but it's a great car. And you're going to buy it for $100,000. Now, right now, we have these promises. Let's suppose it's in writing and all that kind of stuff, so it's enforceable. So you're supposed to buy and I'm supposed to sell. Now, you decide that you want to assign your right to buy that car from me to somebody else. You assign it to Mary. And you say, you assign that right to whatever it takes to make the assignment. I'm not dealing with that at the moment. But you assign it to Mary. Now Mary has the right to buy the car from me for $100,000. So we've changed the people in the contract. The people, you and I were the first two people, and now Mary and I are people in the contract. Likewise, I can assign my right. I have a right to receive the money from you when I deliver the car. I can assign my right to that money to somebody else. So we can assign rights, and this changes the people in the contract. We can assign, by the way, this whole area here is tested about 15% of the time. These together, this whole thing here is about 15%. And yeah, what I'm really after here is that actually this was a little higher. These modifications here are probably more like 20% of these and 15% of this. So I really don't have a number here. Okay. So we understand assignment right. Delegation of duties. You have the obligation to pay me. You have the duty to pay for the car. You have the right to receive the car, but you have the duty to pay for it. Now, if instead of you paying me to receive the car, let's suppose that you want to get your house painted, and you're a house builder. You're a house builder, and you say to somebody else, look, I will build your house for you if you will pay Emerson the $100,000 for the car. Okay? Now, if you make that deal, you are delegating to this other person the obligation to pay me the $100,000 for the car. So you've delegated your duty to somebody else, and exactly what you have to do in order to delegate that duty, we'll talk about that later, but the important thing now is to understand that you've now changed the people in the contract. It used to be between you and me, and now you've delegated, I'm still delivering the car to you, but you're delegating the duty to pay to the person whose house you're going to build. Novation. The novation is the third way to change the people, and in the novation, what happens is that you and I have a contract, and in the case of the contract, and then one of us, wants to be completely replaced in the contract. Not when you assign rights, you assign the rights to somebody else, but for example, you assign to Mary the right to receive the car, but you're still paying me for it. So all three of us are still in the contract. In the case of delegation of the duty, you delegate the duty to somebody else, to Keith, whose house you're building, and Keith is going to pay me, but if Keith doesn't pay me, you still have to pay me. So all three of us are still in the contract. In the case of novation, you end up with a contract with two people. It's just a different two people. You end up with the same people in the contract, but with, it doesn't have to be two people, it can be five people. But the important thing is that one of the people is being replaced by somebody else, and everybody is agreeing to it. Okay? Everybody has to agree to it. So if you and I have a contract and you want to be replaced by Francis, then you and I and Francis all agree that you are to be substituted out completely. You have no more rights, you have no more duties, Francis is your replacement. That's the novation. Obviously, we've changed the people in the contract. And finally, revoking the rights of a third party. Consider the case where I have formed a contract with the Rolls-Royce dealer where I am going to sell my polka dot and striped Rolls-Royce to the dealer. The dealer is going to pay me $100,000 for it. And I say to the dealer, you know what, dealer? Instead of you, I'm giving you the car. Instead of you paying me the $100,000, pay this $100,000 to Mary. And so Mary is obviously the third-party beneficiary because the contract's between me and the Rolls-Royce dealer who's buying my car, and they're paying this third party. So she's a third-party beneficiary of this contract. 3 seconds after I say to the Rolls-Royce dealer, don't pay me, pay her, 3 seconds after that I say to the dealer, I changed my mind, don't pay Mary, pay me after all. Okay? And so now, for 3 seconds, Mary was in that contract, and I just tried to take her out. And the question is, can I do that? Can I put her in the contract and then take her out? And the answer is, yes, I can revoke her rights up to a certain point. I can revoke her rights until her rights have vested, and there's some rules about when her rights vest. And so this is actually subtracting. Here, Mary was in the contract initially as a third-party beneficiary, and now I just took her out, so she's not there at all. So this is really subtracting somebody. So this is adding someone, replacing someone, subtracting someone. So in all cases, you're changing the people in the contract. So what we have so far is we have that there are problems with the formation of the contract. Most bar problems have that. There are a few of the bar problems have this problems with clarifying the terms. There are changes, can be changes. About 15 to 20% of the contracts have changes in the terms or changes in the people, and this is how that happens. And then the next thing comes is breach. I'm going to put this breach where we have plenty of room to write. Breach is here. So the problem becomes, how do you decide whether or not there was a breach of contract? And obviously there are a bunch of rules about whether or not there's a breach of contract. In fact, the rules, there are 3 rules about whether or not something constitutes a breach of contract. Let's put those up here right now. The requirements for breach of contract are, number 1, all conditions have occurred or been, I'm going to abbreviate this here because we're going to put it down more fully when we're doing the analysis. So I'm going to abbreviate here and just say all conditions time and the duty not discharged. So the breach of contract requires that all conditions preceding. Let's go back for a second. In the breach of contract situation, I have formed a contract with you where I'm supposed to paint your house, and I'm supposed to start painting your house following the first 3 dry days in the month. And now we're at the 10th of the month, let's say, and there haven't been 3 consecutive dry days. And that's a condition preceding to my duty to paint. And so if you say, Emerson, why haven't you painted my house? And my duty to paint your house is not absolute yet because it's subject to a condition preceding, namely 3 dry days. Time for performance. The time for performance, if I'm supposed to paint your house by a certain date, obviously if that date hasn't come yet, then I'm not liable for suit yet unless there's anticipatory repudiation. We obviously will talk more about that. And finally, the duty is not discharged. My duty to paint your house might have been discharged because, for example, maybe I've already painted it. Or maybe my duty to paint your house was discharged because it burned down. It's impossible to paint it now. So there are a number of reasons that my duty might be discharged. And the breach of contract is defined as the non-performance of a contract duty which has become absolute. When does a contract duty become absolute? When all conditions precedent have either occurred or been excused. And this, by the way, is a big deal here, and we will talk more about these conditions precedent. How do you decide if a condition has occurred or been excused? Let me show you here before we put this on. The conditions must have either occurred or been excused. A condition occurs because the first three dry days have happened already. But excuse of condition is where a number of things here and substantial performance, which we will talk about extensively, is a major reason for excusing duties. And this happens an awful lot on bar questions. For example, in a bar question where I am to finish your house by September the 20th. This is from a real bar question. I am to finish painting your house by September the 20th, but I finish 10 days late. Now, if I finish 10 days late, you've got a painted house. You got most of what you wanted. And so don't we have substantial performance? And the answer is probably yes. And if I have substantially performed, but I'm a little bit late, or if I've substantially built the house for you, but one of the windows swings the wrong way, or the garage door doesn't work right yet, or anything of that sort where I've done most of what I'm supposed to do, I have substantially performed, then what do? And most complicated contracts end up with substantial performance. And so here you have to know what it is that constitutes substantial performance. How do you decide when I have done enough to qualify as substantial performance? And then if I have done enough so that my work qualifies as substantial performance, what happens next? I'm the contractor, and I've done everything except the garage door doesn't open the right way. I've built your $100,000 house, and now you say you won't pay me because I haven't done what the specifications called for, because the specifications call for the garage door to open a different way. And so what do we do when I'm that close to finishing and yet I haven't done quite what the contract says? And the answer to that, by the way, is that you pay me the contract price minus what it takes to fix the garage door, so that I have committed a minor breach, and so you get to collect for that minor breach, and you can collect just by holding back the money. In the case of substantial performance, if I have only substantially, not completely, perfectly performed, if I've substantially performed, then I have committed a minor breach. Minor, not material. A material breach ends the contract. A minor breach, we keep on going with the contract and try to fix it. And so in my case, when I've done everything except get the garage door to open the right way, then I have substantially performed, and your obligation is to pay me the contract price minus what it takes to fix your garage door, because I'm liable for the garage door because I committed a minor breach. So substantial performance is what I did do. The minor breach is about what I didn't do. So whenever I have only substantially performed, I have also committed a minor breach, and you get to collect for that. So, and the duty is not discharged. There's a whole bunch of ways here. The breach of contract, all conditions preceding must have occurred or been excused. Time for performance has arrived, except for anticipatory repudiation. And my duty to do whatever I'm supposed to do for you has not been discharged. And there are lots of ways that my duty can be discharged. For example, I can discharge my duty to paint your house because it burned down, to repair your boat because it sank. We can discharge, as one case where there was a house that was built. You're the owner of the house, and I'm the contractor, and you contract with me to build this house on the side of the hill so that you get a beautiful view of the valley down below. And so I start building this house on this building spot on the side of the hill, and about halfway through the construction of your house, you enter into a separate contract with me to build a garage right next to your house. And that makes sense. Now what happens is that I finish building your house, and just a few days after, but I haven't finished the garage yet because it started late. A few days after I finish building your house, along comes an unprecedented storm and washes away not only your house goes down the hill, but the building spot where I had built a house for you is no longer there. It's been washed away. And so you can't build there anymore. But the garage, the place where I've half built the garage for you, is still there. Now, let me ask you this question. Do you think I should finish building that garage under these circumstances? The answer is obviously no. And so my duty to complete the garage is discharged by frustration of purpose. And so, again, so contracts get terminated as my duty to build a garage gets discharged by frustration of purpose in this case. It can also be discharged for these other reasons that we talked about, like destruction of the subject matter and so forth. Also, I may have a duty to do something for you, and maybe we modified the contract, so I don't have that duty anymore. Well, that's another way to discharge the duty, by modifying the contract, and so forth. So there's a bunch of these, and we'll be talking about those. So we're at the point now, in summary, where we know that contracts questions generally involve formation issues. They may involve clarifying the terms. They may or may not. They may involve changes to the contract. That's changes in the terms, such as a modification is the most common, and changes in the people to the contract. There are 4 ways to change the people. About 15% of the contracts do that. And now that we have formed the contract, we got the terms cleared, we modified anything that needed to be modified, changed people, and now we look at the breach, and the breach of contract is defined as the non-performance of a contract duty which has become absolute. So the question becomes, when is a contract duty absolute? And the answer is the contract duty becomes absolute when these 3 requirements have been satisfied. And those 3 requirements are: all conditions preceding have occurred, or been excused, time for performance has arrived, and the duty has not been discharged. Now, if you have a contract and you analyze for breach and it turns out someone has breached the contract, then the next question, of course, is, well, what remedies are you going to get for the breach of contract? And the remedies for a breach of contract really are of 2 types only, and those are legal remedies and equitable remedies. So the remedy for breach of contract here, I'll put them right here. The legal remedy for a breach of contract is money, period. It's damages, it's money, it's nothing else, except 2 exceptions. The 2 exceptions are ejectment and replevin. Think of it. There's a British spelling of this. I'm not sure. Might have mixed them up. The ejectment is for a real property where someone is on your real property and you want them ejected. Now, the law courts historically have always controlled real property. The ecclesiastic courts that used to be around never controlled real property. They controlled personal property for a long time until we put everything in the hands of the law courts. But the ejectment has always been controlled by the law courts, and money damages. So if you sue and you want money damages, that's a legal remedy. If you want someone ejected off your property, that's a legal remedy. You didn't go to the ecclesiastic courts for that. And finally, replevin if you want your personal property back, and you get the court can tell the sheriff, go out and get that car off of John's lot and bring it back here and give the car to this person who really owns it. That's repleving. You go out and get the Mona Lisa, take it off your wall and bring it back here to the court so we can give it to the rightful owner. That's replevin. It's the same thing as rejectment, only they're going to get the personal property and bringing it to the court. Ejectment, you're just kicking somebody off of your real property. You can't very well pick up the real property and bring it to court. So you eject the people off and put the new owners on. So money damages, ejectment, and replevin are the only legal remedies. Everything else is equity. And in the case of a breach of contract, the most common thing you want is specific performance, where you want to make the person do what they promised to do as opposed to just pay money in place of it. For example, I have a contract with you to buy from you a copy, the Mona Lisa. Well, there's only one. And if you breach the contract and you want to give me money damages instead, well, that won't do. I want that Mona Lisa. So specific performance is applicable in many cases where money is simply not an adequate remedy. Secondly, besides these equity, there's also equity can cancel contracts. And that's about it. They can enforce them, they can cancel them, and these are your equitable remedies. Now, so we're at the point then where contracts formed, and on these bar questions, about 92% of the time you're going to have formation issues. You clarify the terms by dealing with parole evidence, ambiguity, and mistake. Most of the time these issues are not there, but when they are there, you know the rules. All three of these, parole evidence, ambiguity, and mistake, all three of these really deal with the intent of the parties. It's just a different intent. Parole evidence rule is, did they intend for the writing to be complete and final? Ambiguity, what did the parties mean by the ambiguous term? Mistake, what did the parties really mean as opposed to what they wrote down? We typed 91 cents a pound, we really meant 90 cents a pound. Then, so you form a contract, there may be need to clarify terms. There may be changes in the contract, that is, there may be changes in the terms, there may be changes in the people in the contract, and we know how to change, we know about those. We don't have the details yet, but we will. And next, if once you have formed the contract and maybe you've clarified the terms, maybe there were some changes, you put the changes in place, and now the question is, was there a breach? How do you decide if there's a breach? Answer, breach of contract is the non-performance of a contract duty which has become absolute. When has a contract duty become absolute? When these three requirements have been satisfied. All conditions preceding to the person's duty to perform have either occurred or been excused. Time for performance has arrived except for anticipatory repudiation kinds of cases. And the duty has not been discharged. There are lots of ways to discharge the duty, such as destruction of the subject matter and so forth. So if my duty to perform has become absolute because you've satisfied these things, and if I don't perform when my duty is absolute, that's the breach. Now, if I have a breach of contract, so what? Answer, what remedy do you get? You get the legal remedy or the equitable remedy. On bar questions, if they ask you about the rights of the parties, let me put this here, they ask you about the rights, that's asking you about the legal remedy. Money, usually, but possibly ejectment or replevin. But 99% of the time it's money. Equity, if they ask you about the person's remedies, or they ask you about relief, if they ask you about either of those, remedies or relief, they're asking you about the equitable remedy of specific performance. Cancellation, I've never seen this actually happen on the bar, but so it's always specific performance. And you recall that in order to be entitled to specific performance, there's some rules that you have to satisfy. We'll be going through this, of course, in the mnemonic is I'm doing fine, Mom and Dad. And the I is for inadequate remedy at law. The D is for definite contract terms. That is, the equity courts are not going to force somebody to do something unless it's very clear what it is they're supposed to do. Feasible to enforce. Mutuality, meaning that the courts are not going to make me convey the property to you unless they make you pay me for it. And the equitable, the defenses. Now, the defenses to specific performance are things like unclean hands and so forth. We'll deal with this much more completely later. So we're at the point then where you form contracts, clarify terms, look for changes, see if there was a breach. If there's a breach, a person's entitled to remedy. And the final part of the law of contracts is quasi-contract. And so I'm going to put this someplace on the board. I'm going to put it right here. Now, this quasi-contract is different from these other 5 parts because the other 5 parts kind of, if you have a contract, then you got to look out for all this other stuff. In the quasi-contract case, the real problem is that the part of the problem that you're concerned about, you don't have a contract for that part. Let me give you a couple of examples. I'm a house painter, and I come out to paint a house in your neighborhood. And this is a neighborhood where it's a Victorian neighborhood, and all the Victorian houses kind of look alike. And so I come out with my paint buckets and paint and so forth, and lo and behold, I start painting the wrong house. And it's your house. And you see this happening, you come out on the lawn and you sit there every day and you watch me paint the house. At the end of the day, you applaud and you say, great job, great color, and so forth. Keep up the good work. Finally, when I finish your house, you say to me, Emerson, I have news for you. You painted the wrong house. Okay? I never entered into a contract with anyone to paint my house. So that's a situation where I've done a lot of work and there is no contract. So all this stuff about the law of contracts kind of doesn't apply because we don't have a contract. What do you do in that case? And the answer is that you require the homeowner, you're the homeowner, you've got to pay me quasi-contract. Quasi-contract meaning as though we had a contract. You pay me for the value of services rendered. I don't get any profit out of this, but I get the value of services rendered. So you pay me for the value of services rendered, quasi-contract. And that's one way to get to quasi-contract where we never had a contract to begin with. But the whole concept, the idea of quasi-contract is really kind of a part of a bigger idea. And the bigger idea is that we want to prevent people from being unjustly enriched. And you obviously are unjustly enriched if you don't have to pay me for your house under those circumstances. Now, if you weren't sitting there on the lawn watching me do this every day, you were out of the country and I mistakenly painted the wrong house, we have a much more complicated problem. We're not going to deal with that right now. But this is a case where you knew it and you would be unjustly enriched. Finally, consider the case where I have a contract with you, okay, to paint your boat. And I have painted half of your boat and it sank to the bottom of the ocean. I can't paint it anymore. My duty to finish painting your boat is obviously discharged by destruction of the subject matter, so I can't paint anymore. But what about the work I already did? Because your boat that sank to the bottom of the ocean was a more valuable boat than if it had not been half painted. So really, when you collect your insurance or however you're going to deal with that, the point is that I did my work, and it's really, what about the work that I have done? Obviously, I don't get paid for the rest of the painting job. And the answer is, you pay me for the value of the services that I've rendered for the half of the boat that I painted. or the half of the house that I painted. Now this is different from the case where I am building a house for you, and halfway through the building of the house, the whole thing burns down. So I can't, so what do I do now? The answer in that case is I rebuild the whole house. You have no liability, no anything. You hired me to build a house, and if I have to start it 3 or 4 times before it's built, it's really my problem, not yours. And if I'm the contractor, what I do is I take out insurance in case the place burns down halfway through. So if I'm building a house for you and it burns down halfway through, I just have to start over. But if I'm painting your house and it burns down halfway through, you pay me quasi-contract for the work I did, and then that's the end of it. So those are the 2 situations where you get into the quasi-contract case. That is where the work that I did, we really did not have a, the contract cannot be, either we never had a contract, or we had a contract and it came to an end because the boat sank or something like that. In either case, to prevent unjust enrichment, you prevent your unjust enrichment, you pay me for the half a boat I painted, you pay me for the half a house I painted, you don't pay me for the half house I built. Now, those 6 parts really make up the law of contracts. This is what the law of contracts is all about. And what's important is that when you look at a contracts question, you can always break it down into these major parts. Now, I am not saying that you need to write about each of these major parts every time, because obviously if the bar examiners say don't give you any problem with terms that need to be clarified, then writing about the parole evidence rule and ambiguity and mistake would make it seem like you're just following a formula. You're not really doing any legal analysis. And likewise, if the bar examiners didn't give you any modifications of the contract, don't write about modifications and so forth. Speaking of such things, you should know that as to the breach of contract, it is tested 100% of the contracts questions. Every contracts question has a breach issue. The remedies, if you have a substantial problem regarding remedies, it is then called a remedies problem. If they practically gave you the contract, practically gave you the breach, and they wanted you to deal with some complicated problems involving the remedies, that's a remedies problem. If they gave you a complicated contracts problem but very little to do on the remedies, that's a contracts problem. And so whether or not it's treated as a remedies problem depends on how much of the problem is remedies. But in a true contracts question, you will have very little remedies. In a remedies question, it's all remedies. So it's kind of hard to put a number on that. So that's how these contracts problems are. This is how the law of contracts is organized. Write about the issues you were asked about. Don't write about the others. What we are going to do next is we're going to take these principles and we're going to apply them to some contracts problems, to the contracts problems that I told you about, the ones that you need to read. Motors versus Jones, Buyer-Seller-Turbin, and the Owens-Carter problem. And the first thing we're going to do with these problems is that we're going to see how, when you look at the facts that the bar examiners have presented to you, I want you to see how you can organize the facts that they gave you into facts about. You can organize the facts into facts regarding the formation, facts regarding clarifying the terms, facts regarding changing the terms, facts regarding breach, facts regarding the remedies, and even some facts regarding quasi-contracts if you have that issue. And if you can see how the facts that they gave you, these set of facts are about formation, these set of facts are about modification, that once you have the problem that well organized, that you can then begin to bring up your rules about the law of formation and apply them. Keeps the answer very organized, and that's what we're going to do next. So that is the end of this lecture, and we will start the next lecture with dealing with those 3 problems. You will need, for those problems, you need the problems actually in your possession in front of you, because I'm going word by word with regard to certain parts of the problem. That is the end of this lecture.